But Duratha misjudged one thing. That broken man had been hiding his face for a lifetime. And tonight, for the very first time, this is the story of the 15 years the truth was buried. And it begins with a full moon and the boar hunt.
Welcome to African Ruth Stories, where we share the rich cultural heritage of Africa.
They dragged her out of the royal chamber in chains, a princess of the blood, and forced her to marry a mute stable boy in a forgotten corner of the kingdom, because her own family feared she was more beautiful than the heir to the throne. Tonight's story begins in the realm of Eldoria, a kingdom of silver towers and deep forests, where a young princess is about to learn that the man everyone calls worthless is the greatest king the realm has ever known. In the high kingdom of Eldoria, far to the north, where the rivers run silver between the cedar hills and the sea cliffs drop their white plumes into the mist, there lived a princess the poets could not stop writing about. Her name was Princess Seraphina of House Valentis, the only daughter of the late King Aldrich and Queen Mother Muriel. The Kingdom of Eldoria was not the largest of the 5 great kingdoms of the world. It was smaller than the Northern Dominion and older than the Southern Empire. But it was the richest in song. Its bards were paid in silver for a single couplet. Its scholars were invited to 3 universities in a single year. And its royal library, 6 floors of carved walnut and stained glass, held 10,000 books that no other library in the world possessed. Into this kingdom, 22 years before the night our story begins, the late Queen Muriel had given birth to a daughter with eyes the color of late wheat and a laugh that could empty a great hall of its bickering. The people of the lower town said the new princess had been born already half wise. The court astrologers wrote into the royal archives that her birth matched the polar stars of the old queens of the realm, the queens who had not feared the common man, who had ruled kindly and brought peace to the land. She was named Seraphina. The name means the burning one. Her father had chosen it, he said, because she had been born during the week of the Candle Festival, when the whole city was ablaze with little lights, and the first thing the midwife had heard as she drew the babe into the world was the great bell of the high chapel ringing out the hour. Seraphina was not the crown princess. That title belonged to her older cousin, Prince Cassian, son of the current regent, Lord Regner. Cassian was a thin and cautious boy, clever in council, but fearful of horses and fearful of crowds. He was, the people whispered among themselves, a prince who would rather rule from a chair than walk among his people. But it was Seraphina whom the kingdom loved. Wherever she walked, in the gardens, through the lower town, in the market at festival time, the common folk bowed low. Not because they had to, because they wanted to. The fishwives laid the best of their catch at her feet. The candlemakers gave her the first flame of every new year. The children of the laundry district, who could not read, wrote her name in chalk upon the walls and then blew the chalk away like a prayer, as if they could send her name up to heaven itself. Her laughter could brighten the great hall. Even when the cold winds had the old king coughing in his chair, when his counselors brought bad news from the border or the treasury, when the priests read out the long lists of the dead. Even then, when Seraphina came into the great hall, the candles seemed to burn taller and the shadows to step back. Her voice, when she sang in the chapel on feast days, made even the stones seem to listen. The underpriest, Father Ansel, once told her, when she was only 14, that the chapel's angels fell silent when she sang, because they did not want to compete. She was, in short, the heart of Eldoria. And that, more than anything, more than her beauty, more than her title, more than her name, was the reason her aunt feared her. For in the Kingdom of Eldoria, a beloved princess was a very dangerous thing, especially when she stood beside a prince who was secretly feared by his own court. Lady Dorotha had been born into a lesser house, a house of merchants who had purchased their name at the edge of the southern province. But she had married power when she married Lord Regner, elder brother to the late King Aldrich, and the man who now ruled Eldoria as regent until Cassian came of age. She wore her wealth like armor. Diamonds in her hair, tied in a thin net of silver that caught the light in every audience hall. Fox fur at her throat, white as snow, never the same scarf twice. Pearls at her wrists that clinked softly when she was angry, the way a snake's rattle warns of the strike to come. She had one child, a daughter named Lady Iselda, and one ambition, to see Iselda become the next queen of Eldoria, wed to her own cousin Cassian, and ruling from the high chapel together as sister-wife to the prince and daughter to the regent. But there was an obstacle. The obstacle was blonde-haired and 17 years old, and had a smile that emptied gardens of their doves. Every suitor who came to court, every merchant prince from the southern ports, every visiting diplomat from the icy northern kingdoms, every wandering scholar knight who had won 3 duels and a ballad, they all looked once at Iselda, polished and perfect and silent in her chair, and then twice at Seraphina, who had flour on her sleeve from the kitchens she had been helping in that morning.
Dorotha watched this with the patience of a spider. She watched it for years. At the long table on icy feast days, in the candle-lit corridors of the upper halls, in the private galleries of the choir loft where the chapel choir rehearsed twice a week. Dorotha watched it on the day the winter festival was held at the long table, when Iselda sat at her mother's right hand and Seraphina walked in unannounced, in a simple gray dress, to deliver bread to the lower tables. And 3 young lords excused themselves from Iselda's company to follow Seraphina instead. Dorotha watched it on the day the northern ambassador came to court, and Iselda sang the high hymn beautifully. But Seraphina, who had not been told she would sing, was asked to sing by the ambassador himself, and brought the great hall to tears with a single verse. Dorotha watched it on the day Cassian, who was now 19, came to her privately and asked, in a thin and careful voice, whether, in 3 years' time, when he would be of age, he might consider Princess Seraphina for the role of queen. Dorotha had smiled. She had said she would think upon it, and she had begun to weave. That winter, when the snows closed the mountain passes and the castle sat thick with smoke and suspicion, Dorotha leaned close to her husband one night in the candle-lit bedchamber and whispered, "If Seraphina takes a husband before our daughter does, we lose our place in the succession. Find her one, and quickly. But find her one so beneath her, so ruined, so forgotten, that no future king will ever look twice at her again, and make her thank us for it." Lord Regner hesitated. He was not, in his heart, a cruel man. He was a frightened one. He feared his wife's displeasure more than he feared the gods, and he feared the memory of his dead brother more than either. "Tell me what to do," he had said. And Dorotha had told him. And so the trap was laid. By morning, Dorotha had summoned Steward Marlen, the chief steward of House Valentis, a thin, bitter man with quick eyes and slow hands, who served the regent because he had nowhere else to go. His father had been a steward. His father's father had been a steward. He had been raised in the lower town, but educated in the great hall, and he had lived in the world between them all his life, belonging to neither. "Find me a man," Dorotha told him, "of no name, no house,
and no future. Find me a man to be presented to the princess as her bridegroom. Make him broken. Make him ashamed to lift his eyes to her. Make it so that every noble in Eldoria will pity her, not envy her, when they hear the news." "How broken?" asked the steward. "Broken in the back, if you can find one," Daratha said. "Broken in the spirit, if you cannot. Make him so small that even the lowest of the servants will not look at him twice." 3 days later, in the lower town beyond the castle walls, near the tanner's yard and the slaughterhouse, where the carts came in at dawn with the offal and the cabbage, the steward found a young man sleeping in the straw behind a goat pen. His name was Edric. He was a stable hand. He had no house, no inheritance, no living kin. He had been raised by the castle's farrier after being abandoned as a child at the gates. He had been given the surname Edric because the farrier's wife had heard a passing bard sing a song about a forgotten prince in the same week the babe had been left, and she had thought it a good omen. He was 21 years old. He was tall, but folded himself small. He had rough hands from rope and iron. He had a quiet voice that never carried beyond the horse he was speaking to. He had been told, since he was a small child, that no one would ever love him, and he had believed it. What Daratha did not know, what no one in the kingdom knew, was that the stable hand Edric had not always been Edric. Long before he had come to Eldoria as a boy, the kingdom had quietly fallen to a most terrible rumor. That the infant Prince Aelric, the younger brother of King Aldric, who had been stolen in a night of fire 15 years ago, might still be alive somewhere, hidden, disguised, waiting. It was the kind of rumor a kingdom tells itself to ease its grief. Every kingdom in the world had at least one such rumor: a lost prince, a vanished heir, a sleeper under a hill. Most of them were lies. But this one was not. 15 years earlier, on a winter night so cold the river had frozen to its bed, the old royal chapel of Eldoria had burned. It had not been a fire of accident. It had been a fire of conspiracy, though no one in the kingdom knew that then, and few knew it now. A candle left too close to a curtain, a door quietly locked from the outside, a guard deliberately turned away at the hour when the babe was being changed. In the great fire that followed, a loyal servant of Queen Muriel had carried the infant prince, the second son of King Aldric, the babe Aelric, out through the smoke to the river gate, and the city guards had hunted them through the snow. The servant was caught at the gates. He died 2 days later, in the lower dungeon, with the name of the Queen Mother on his lips. But the baby had vanished, smuggled in the chaos by a farrier's wife who had been passing through the alleyway with a sack of feed and had seen the loyal servant fall. She had hidden the babe in the sack of feed. She had carried him 2 streets, then 4, then 7. She had ducked into her own yard while the search bells rang across the city. She had put him in the straw behind her own hearth, fed him with goat's milk from her own supply, and named him Edric. And that night, and every night for 15 years, she had whispered the same words to him as she tucked him into his corner of the straw. "Never tell anyone the scar on your shoulder, the 3 stars of House Valentis, which your mother kissed you with on the night you were born. Never speak the name Aelric. And never, ever forget that one day, my son, you will sit upon the throne your father loved." Edric had grown tall by stealth, hiding his height by stooping when lords passed. He had grown quiet by practice, never speaking above a whisper in case his voice carried the timbre of the blood. He had learned the language of horses, of straw, of obedience.
He polished boots until his hands ached. He curtsied to visiting lords in the courtyard without being told. He was invisible, exactly what the farrier's wife had meant him to be. But he had not forgotten. And across the kingdom, in a hidden tower of the royal archives, an old woman, the archivist Vela, the last surviving member of Queen Muriel's household, had spent 15 years piecing together the truth of that night. She had found the farrier's widow, who had died of fever 4 winters ago, but had written everything down in a small leather book. She had found the midwife's ledgers in the eastern capital. She had found a witness in a foreign monastery, the dying servant's own brother, who had fled across the sea. She had found Aelric. And she had sent a single sealed letter, 2 months ago, to a man the court of Eldoria thought did not exist. A wandering scholar prince from the southern kingdoms, whose title was King of the Hidden Throne, and whose life's mission had been to walk the 5 kingdoms and restore lost bloodlines to their rightful seats of power. His name, too, was Edric. The same name. Because it was the name the farrier's widow had given her husband from the bard's song, and the southern king had adopted that name as his throne name when he had taken the vow. That was the secret the steward's men had stumbled upon when they dragged the stable boy into the castle on a freezing morning and locked him in a chamber where a princess would be presented, in chains, with her future husband. The summons came for Seraphina at dawn. She had been sleeping, or pretending to sleep, in the eastern wing of the castle, the wing her father, the old king, had given her when she was a child, and which her aunt had not yet found the courage to take from her. The tapestries of white unicorns still hung on her walls, untouched for 15 years. The music box her mother had given her on her 7th birthday still sat on the table by the window, slightly tarnished, slightly off-key, but playable if you wound it just so. A reading desk of carved walnut still held the letters her father had written to her from the war. Letter after letter after letter. One for each season she had been alive without him, sent from camps and tents, and at last, from the deathbed at the northern border. She had read them so many times the parchment had begun to soften at the edges. Summoned to the small council chamber, the page had whispered through the locked door. Your aunt commands it. The regent commands it. She had not demanded her release. She had not wept. She had washed her face, brushed her hair, and put on a simple gray dress, the same shade as the candles of the lower chapel. Then she had walked the long corridors of the eastern wing, through the painted hallways and down the stair of carved stone until she had come to the small council chamber at the heart of the castle. When she entered, she saw the regent seated high, Lady Dorotha beside him in green that was almost black at the cuffs, and at the far end of the room, behind a velvet curtain of deep crimson, a man standing in servant's clothes, his head bowed. "Approach, child," Lord Regner said, with the oily gentleness of a man who has already decided your life for you. Seraphina approached. She could smell the velvet curtain, old velvet, dusty velvet, the velvet of a room that had not been opened for a year. She could see a shadow behind it. She could hear a soft breath. The curtain was pulled. There stood a young man, perhaps her own age, dressed in a stable-hand's rough linen, hair cut short, hands roughened by rope and iron. He did not lift his head. His shoulders were rounded. His eyes were downcast. He looked like a man who had been broken in 7 places and stitched back together badly. "This," said Dorotha, "is your bridegroom. His name is Edric. He is a stable hand. He is of no house. He is of no value. He is, in fact, a man no one in this kingdom would notice if he walked out the gate tomorrow and never came back. You will marry him at dawn tomorrow in the chapel of the lower town, with no guests, no blessing, and no celebration. From this night on, you will live in the servants' quarters. You will no longer be received at court. You will no longer be called a princess. You will be a wife of nothing, and you will have children of nothing, and your name will be forgotten in 3 generations. Seraphina stared. The candle on the council table flickered. "You cannot do this," she whispered. "We can," said Lord Regner. "We are the regents." "We are," said Lady Dorotha, "and we have." She had not moved her eyes from the bridegroom's bowed head. She had not noticed what Seraphina now noticed, that the bridegroom's hands, though they hung slack at his sides, were not shaking. They were not the hands of a broken man. They were the hands of a man who had learned to make himself look broken because survival had demanded it. And when she turned to him, to scream at him, to curse him, to beg him to refuse, to ask him how he could let this be done to her, he lifted his eyes for one single moment, and what she saw there stopped her breath. Not shame, not weakness, not the lazy obedience of a man sold. Recognition. It was the look of a man who had waited 15 years for this moment, and who was not afraid. Seraphina, who had been afraid since the day she had learned her parents were dead, felt, for the first time in 7 years, that she was not alone. She lowered her eyes. She bowed her head very slightly, as if accepting the sentence, and she turned to leave. "Tonight," Lady Dorotha called after her, "you will be brought to the bridegroom in the lower keep. You will not sleep alone. A marriage must be witnessed." Seraphina did not turn. She walked out of the chamber as if she had not heard. She had heard perfectly well. That night, in the room the steward had given them, a cold stone chamber near the kitchens with one small window that did not quite close and a single bed of plain deal, Edric and Seraphina sat across from each other.
Not as bride and groom, as 2 people who knew their lives had been written by others, and who had decided, in the breath between the door closing and the candle being lit, that they would write the next chapters themselves. "You know me," she said finally. "You know who I am." He did not answer. For years he had been silent because his survival had depended on silence. And even now, even here, in a stone room with no one listening through the walls, or so he hoped, he measured his words like a farrier measures iron. "I will not harm you," he said, simple and soft. "I would never harm you. Whatever they have told you about me, whatever they have told you about yourself, neither of those things is true." Seraphina studied him. He had scars on his hands, 3 small scars, one above the other, like the dimples a farrier makes when he tests the shoe. He had a small white scar on his jaw from a fall in childhood. He had the rough manners of a servant, but the eyes of a man who had learned not to be afraid. "And who then are you?" she whispered. He hesitated. He looked at the door. He looked at the window. He listened for footsteps in the corridor beyond. None came. He lifted his collar just slightly with the corner of his finger, and he let her see, on the inner edge of his left shoulder, where the muscle curved down to the arm, 3 small stars in pale ink that had been pricked into the skin the night he was born. The mark of House Valentis. The mark of the true blood. Her eyes went wide. She clapped her hand to her mouth. She looked at him, and then at the stars, and then at him again, as if she had been struck by lightning from a sky that had been pressed down upon her all her life.
"Mother of Heaven," she breathed. "Be silent, Your Highness," he whispered, "and be patient. Be silent until the moon is full. Be patient until the boar is hunted. And then I will tell you everything, and you will help me do what must be done." They looked at each other for a long time. "What do I call you?" she asked. "Edric," he said. "Tonight and every night that we are watched, I am Edric. From this night until the moon is full, Edric is the only name I have. Aelric is the name of a man who has not yet been born." She nodded. She had spent a lifetime being patient.
At dawn, in the lower town's chapel of rough stone and stained glass, the chapel where the carters and the washerwomen and the children of the laundry district were married for 2 candles and a copper coin, the priest performed the rite. The priest had been bribed. 3 silver cups had been left at his door the night before, and a small bag of salt from the eastern province. Salt being, in the old law, the symbol of binding. He had taken them. He had not wanted to. He had taken them because his daughter needed a wedding dress of her own, and he had no money. The witnesses were 10, all servants, all sworn to silence under threat of the lower mines. Serafina wore a plain dress of gray wool, which had been laid at the foot of her bed that morning by an unknown hand. She had since suspected the cook, Mara, but had never been able to confirm. Edric stood beside her in his stable clothes. The priest spoke the words in a voice so quiet even the candles could not hear. The witnesses, in their dull coats, looked at the floor. Behind them, in shadow, stood Lady Dorotha, watching for the precise moment when the princess broke. Serafina did not break. She had promised herself she would not break. She lifted her chin, looked at Dorotha straight through the gloom, and said, clearly enough for every servant in the chapel to hear, and clearly enough that Dorotha would remember it for the rest of her life. "Remember this face, my lady, the face you wanted to forget. Because one day, when you are old and the snow has come to your door, you will tell your grandchildren that you saw this face on the day you tried to end it, and you will not be able to tell them whether you wept with sorrow or with fear." Dorotha's smile tightened, but she heard. And the wedded pair, with bread and salt and a single white rose from the chapel garden, the rose having been placed mysteriously on the altar that morning by no one who would admit to it, were sent to the servants' quarters on the east side of the lower town, to begin their new life as a stable boy and a disgraced princess, while their betters feasted in the great hall above, and while the 7-course meal of that night's feast was announced by the heralds along the corridors they had just left behind. What followed were the longest months of Serafina's life. She slept on a straw mattress that smelled of hay and old horse. She cooked her own meals over a small hearth. She cleaned chambers she had once walked through as royalty. The chamber of the south guest, the chamber of the music room, the closet of the lower chapel. And the servants who had known her as a princess turned away when she passed, for fear of Dorotha's spies. But there were also servants who had loved her father. There was Mara, the old cook, who slipped her extra bread beneath a cold plate at the back of the kitchen. There was Bren, the gardener's son, who left wildflowers on her windowsill every other morning, tied with a thread of pale green. There was Father Ansel, the underpriest, who heard her confessions each Sunday and never once asked her to confess shame, because he could see that she had none to confess. She began teaching the children of the servants to read in a small back room of the laundry by candlelight. She had learned to read from her mother's letters, and her mother had learned from hers, and it was the one inheritance that no one had been able to take from her.
The first evening, only 3 children came. They were 8, 9, and 11 years old, the children of the bottle washer, the candle maker, and the lower tanner. They held their slates like shields and stared at her as if she had walked out of a stained glass window. "What shall we read, princess?" asked the eldest, who had been told to call her princess by a mother who had never forgotten who she was. Seraphina smiled. "We shall read the story of the 5 singers of the South," she said. "Singers who lost their voices and found them again." The children looked at her. Their eyes widened. They could not imagine a singer who had lost her voice. But they nodded. They opened their slates, and she taught. By the end of the first month, 10 children came. By the end of the second, 20. By the end of the third, the mothers came too, and stood in the doorway with their arms folded, listening. Not to the reading, but to the way she read. To the way her voice rose and fell. To the way she made the words feel as if they had been made for this room, this evening, this hour. Word spread, as word always spreads in the lower town, like the smoke of a particularly fragrant dinner. Soon, what had been a small school became a quiet revolution. The princess who was supposed to be forgotten was becoming the teacher of an entire district of the city. The candlemaker's daughters could spell their names. The washerwomen's sons could sign their work. The blacksmith's younger boys could read the orders that came in from the great houses, and they no longer had to be cheated by the foreign merchants at the riverside. Edric disappeared during the day. Dorotha had ordered him back to the stables to break him further, to put him among the horses and the mucking out, in the hope that the smell of the stalls would remind him every hour that he was nothing. But in the evenings, he returned to the small stone room, and he would tell Seraphina of what he had learned in the great hall. In the corners where stable hands were invisible and therefore allowed to overhear the conversations of lords. "Lord Regner is afraid," Edric said one night, as they sat on the hearth and ate the bread Mara had left for them. "The northern envoys came today. They asked to see the true king of the blood. They said they had been told, by a source they would not name, that he lives." "And the regent told them?" "He told them stories of madness. He said the old king's blood died with the chapel fire, and that anyone who made such claims now was a witch or a liar." "Did they believe him?" "They are still in the city," Edric said. "They are waiting to look into it themselves." Seraphina's heart hammered. She set down her bread. She thought of the chapel of the snow, the chapel that had burned, the chapel that her father had rebuilt 3 times in his life because he could not bear to think of it in ashes. "There is more," Edric added. He reached into his shirt and produced a folded parchment sealed with red wax the color of dried blood. "This came for you today, from the archivist Vela by the hand of the gardener's boy." Seraphina read it by candlelight. The wax broke in 2 clean halves. The parchment inside was thin and smelled of ink and of dust. It said, "Your Highness, when the moon is full and the boar is hunted, I will send you the truth you have been denied. Until then, trust the man they say has nothing. He is your kingdom's last hope. V." Seraphina folded the parchment. She held it close to her heart. She did not weep, for she had promised herself she would not weep again until the moon was full. "The boar hunt," she said. "That is 3 weeks from tonight." 3 weeks, Edric said. "And in those 3 weeks, I will hear everything. And in those 3 weeks, I will be ready." "For what?" she asked. "For whatever the moon decides," he said. But this was not the only change that 3 weeks of waiting brought. In the high east tower of the castle, Lady Iselda, Dorotha's daughter, The cousin, who was supposed to be queen, sat at her embroidery frame and did not sew. She was 19 years old. She had been raised to believe she was the future of Eldoria. She had been told, since she was small, that the court was hers, that the kingdom was hers, that the prince would one day be hers. She had worn the finest gowns since she was 8. She had been given the gold cup at every feast. She had been taught to dance, to sing, to ride, to speak, everything except to ask whether what she had been told was true. For the first time in her life, she had begun to ask. It had begun the morning after Serafina's wedding. Iselda had walked into her mother's chambers to find Dorotha at her mirror, smiling at her own reflection in a way Iselda had never seen before, a small, tight, private smile that did not reach her eyes. Iselda had watched from the doorway for a moment before announcing herself, and in that moment she had seen, for the first time, what her mother truly was. "Mother," she had said, "you seem pleased with yourself." "I am pleased," Dorotha had answered. "The matter of Serafina is settled." "It does not look settled, Mother. It looks begun." "It is begun, ended, and forgotten," Dorotha had said. "Within a month she will be pregnant from the stable boy, and after that she will be of no interest to anyone in this kingdom. Within 6 months, Cassian will not be able to remember her name." "Should a princess be remembered?" Iselda had asked. Dorotha had looked at her daughter sharply. "She was not a princess," Dorotha had said. "She was a complication. A princess is what I have raised you to be." But Iselda had gone away troubled. In the weeks that followed, she had asked the servants, carefully, never directly, what the lower town said of the wedding. The servants had told her, reluctantly, that the lower town said the princess had spoken to Dorotha in the chapel, and that her words had made the candle flames lean as if to listen. She had asked the cathedral priests what they remembered of the old king. They had told her that he had been a kind man who had once walked through the lower town in disguise to hear what his people really thought of him, and who had wept, one winter, at the door of a farrier's widow and given her a sack of gold to feed her orphan boy through the cold months. She had asked Cassian, on the 3rd week, what he remembered of his cousin. And Cassian, who did not love Serafina but had respected her more than he respected his own ambition, had answered, "I remember that when I was a boy and afraid of the storm, she was the only one who would sit with me in the dark and not laugh at me for shaking. I remember that she once, when we were children, gave me half her bread because I had not been given any that morning, and she said the bread was better when it was shared." "And what else?" Iselda had asked. "Nothing else," Cassian had said. "That is enough." And on the night of the 4th week, with the boar hunt only 3 days away, Iselda went to her mother's chambers and closed the door and said, "Mother, I will not marry Cassian." Dorotha had looked up from her embroidery. "You will," she had said. "We have arranged it since you were 3 years old." "Mother," Iselda had said, "I do not believe what you have told me about Serafina. I do not believe she is what you say she is, and I do not believe, any more, that the kingdom belongs to me by right." Dorotha had set down her needle. She had not moved. She had looked at her daughter, and for the first time in her life, Iselda had seen something cross her mother's face that she had not seen before. It was not anger. It was not fear. It was grief. "What do you believe?" Dorotha had asked, in a voice that was, for the first time in Iselda's life, only a voice. "I believe," Iselda had said, "that the moon is about to be full, and that the boar is about to be hunted, and that something is about to happen in this kingdom that will change everything. And I believe, Mother, that what changes everything may not be what you have planned." Dorotha had been silent for a long time. Then she had risen,
crossed the room and embraced her daughter. And Iselda, who had been a child and who was almost a queen, had felt her mother tremble in her arms. "Be safe tonight," Dorotha had whispered. "Whatever happens." "I will," Iselda had said, and she had meant it. The boar hunt was the great winter rite of Eldoria. Every noble in the kingdom rode out with hounds and horns into the White Forest, while the regent's bloodline was publicly praised and privately toasted, and while the huntsmen laid the long tables in the forest glade where the kill was to be made. This year, the hunt was larger than usual. The northern envoys had come, 5 of them, with their long cloaks and their pale eyes. They had arrived on the 3rd day of the last week of winter, and they had asked to be allowed to ride with the king's own household. Lord Regner had welcomed them. He was a man who liked to be seen with great guests, and the northern envoys were among the greatest in the world. There had also come, 2 days earlier, a strange, masked guest from the southern kingdoms, a man in a scholar's robe who had asked to be admitted, in formal letters, as a witness to the great hunting rite of Eldoria. He had given his name as Edric of Valdren, and he had said he was a wandering scholar of the old laws who had come to see the rite performed as it had been performed 1,000 years ago. Lord Regner had welcomed the masked man readily, hoping to impress him with Eldoria's ancient glory. But Seraphina, hidden at the edge of the forest with the servants who had come to watch the kill, knew the truth her aunt did not. That masked guest was not a scholar. He was the king of the hidden throne himself, a prince traveler whose name was whispered across the 5 kingdoms as the man who found lost heirs and restored them to their seats of power. A man who had walked 1,000 roads and could not be bought. A man who had been searching for Aelric Valentis for 7 years, and had found him, at last, in a kingdom-wide letter signed by an archivist he had never met. He had come for Edric. And Edric, in his stable clothes, with his rough hands and his 3 small stars on his shoulder, had slipped into the forest before dawn, as he had done every night for a week, to meet with the old archivist in a clearing that no one else knew about. The morning of the hunt was cold and bright. The hounds were led out into the trees by 3 hornblowers in red. The lords rode out in pairs, laughing, shouting, kicking their horses into the drifts of white. The northern envoys rode side by side with Prince Cassian, who was trying not to look afraid. Lord Regner rode at the center of the line, his face set in a mask of confidence. Lady Dorotha did not ride. She watched from the high balcony of the upper keep, beside Lady Iselda, who had said she did not feel well and would prefer to stay inside. Edric, with a sack of feed over his shoulder, walked behind the hounds, in the place a stable hand was supposed to walk. The masked scholar rode at the rear of the column, 14 horses behind the last lord, and no one looked at him twice. In the back of the column, no one noticed when Edric slipped past a corner of trees and was gone. In a clearing deep in the White Forest, by the light of a single torch, Archivist Vela knelt before Edric. She was an old woman, 83 years old, with a back bent by half a century of reading in the archives. She had walked to this clearing through the snow, in the dark, by a path she had marked with red thread on the trunks of the trees, and her knees ached with every step. She removed her glove, and with a small silver knife, the same knife her mother had used to mark the royal records when she had been a young archivist in the time of the late queen, she traced the 3 stars on his shoulder, comparing them to the birthmark drawn in the royal archives. "It is true," she whispered, weeping. "Oh, heaven, it is true. You are Aelric Valentis, the second son of King Aldrich and Queen Muriel, stolen in the chapel fire, hidden in love, and raised in shadow. And you are the rightful king of Eldoria, by blood, by law, by the fivefold compact of the broken thrones. The masked scholar stepped forward. He removed his mask. He was older, 40 perhaps, with the lined face of a man who had walked 1,000 roads and the dark eyes of a man who had been searching for 15 years for the one heir he had failed to find in any other kingdom. "Your Majesty," he said, kneeling in the snow, "I am King Talric of the southern kingdom of Valdrin. I and 3 other kings have spent 15 years searching for the lost heirs of the broken thrones. We have found 4 in 4 kingdoms, and we have restored 3 of them. You are the 5th. "The 5 kingdoms," said Vela, "have agreed to a compact. It was signed in the year of your birth, when 3 of the 5 thrones of the world were taken by force, and 2 were." As they rode toward the capital that day, every village watched. Every noble who had come for the hunt watched, and every servant in the lower town, including those who loved Seraphina, came out from behind their closed doors to see. Because it had been written in 1,000 hearth tales, in the songs of the bards and the prayers of the priests, that if the 5 kings ever rode together again, the world would be made anew. And on this night, they rode. At the gates of Eldoria, Lord Regner tried to bar them. 40 guards in the livery of House Valentis stood in 2 ranks, spears lowered across the gate. Lord Regner stood at their head, in his robes of office, his face as pale as the snow behind him. "No king enters," he said, "without the regent's leave." King Talric, who was riding at the head of the 5 kings, smiled grimly. He was a man of 58, with a face the color of walnut and a voice that carried across rivers. He reined his horse. He reached into the leather packet at his belt. He drew out the parchment of the compact. "By this compact," he said, "I, Talric of Valdrin, with the king of the White Hills, the queen of the Sapphire Coast, and the prince of the Iron Marches behind me, and the lost heir of Eldoria beside me, do enter the gates of the capital of Eldoria, by the law of 5 kingdoms, signed by the blood of kings, witnessed by the gods." He read aloud the compact of the broken thrones. Then he read aloud the record of the chapel fire. Then he read aloud the testimony of the midwife, who had been paid and silenced. Then he read aloud the testimony of the farrier's widow, who had died of fever but had written everything down in a small leather book. Then he read aloud the testimony of the dying servant's own brother, who had fled across the sea and had carried the truth in his heart for 15 years. "You have ruled unlawfully for 15 years, Talric said. "You have stolen a king's birthright. You have starved a princess of her honor. You have married a prince of the blood to a stable boy in chains to hide what you have done." "I deny it," Regner said, his face paler still. "All of it." "Then let the blood speak," said Archivist Vela, stepping forward from the column of kings. She led Aelric, in his stable boy clothes still, no longer caring, because what mattered now was not the costume, but the man, into the great hall. And she bared his shoulder for all the court to see. 3 stars, the mark of Valentis, burned onto his skin the night he was born, by the hand of his own mother, in the candlelight of his own chamber, in the presence of the 7 great lords of the realm. Silence. The great hall, which had been ringing with laughter and the clatter of plates a moment before, fell silent as a chapel of the dead. Then, slowly, from the back of the hall, the visiting northern envoys rose and knelt. Then the southern lords.
then the Eastern merchants. Then the underpriest, Father Ansel, who had heard the princess's confessions for 7 years, and had never once asked her to confess shame. Then the cook Mara. Then the gardener's son Bryn. Then every servant in the hall, except those who wore the regent's badge and who stood frozen by the doors. One by one, like a tide, the whole court bent its knee. Lord Regner looked at his wife. Doratha looked at her daughter. Iselda looked at the floor. She did not look ashamed. She looked like a woman who had made a decision, sometime in the last 3 weeks, and who had stood by it, and who was now ready to bear the fruit of it. "By the law of the 5 kingdoms," said King Talric, "the throne of Eldoria is restored to its rightful blood. Lord Regner, you are bound over to the Council of Kings for trial. You will not be executed, for kings of blood do not execute each other. But you will be exiled this night to the icy north, with 1 horse, 1 servant, and 1 shilling. Lady Doratha, you are stripped of all titles, all holdings, all jewels. You will be remanded to the keeping of your daughter Iselda, who will see to your care, but you will never again sit at the high table. Your daughter Iselda is given into the keeping of Princess Seraphina, who may judge her as she sees fit." "And the princess?" someone whispered from the back of the hall. "She is free," said Aelric, his voice breaking for the first time. "She was always free. She was never anything but free. Whoever has told this kingdom that she was less than free has lied, and the lie has now ended." The doors of the lower keep were opened. Seraphina walked out, in her rough gray dress, into a snow so white it seemed the sky itself had been made new. She walked slowly, with her head up and her hands loose at her sides, as if she were walking out of a chapel rather than a dungeon. The chains had been struck from her wrists an hour earlier by a guard who had crossed himself twice before doing it, and who stood apart from the others as if he had done the only good thing of his life. The people of the lower town had gathered in their hundreds at the gate of the keep. The cook Mara in her apron, the gardener's son Bryn in his muddy boots, the underpriest Father Ansel in his threadbare cassock, the washerwomen, the candlemakers, the stable hands, the farrier's sons, the baker's daughters, the children of the laundry district, with their slates under their arms, in case the princess was still teaching that day and would not want to lose a single lesson. They fell to their knees before her. She lifted them up, one by one. She took the cook's flour-covered hand and held it. She took the gardener's son's rough hand and held it. She took Father Ansel's worn hand and held it. She wept for the first time in 7 years, openly, in front of the people she had been sent to forget and who had refused to forget her. Then she looked up. She saw, at the far end of the street, still in his stable clothes, still with rough hands and a small white scar on his jaw, Aelric. He had walked ahead of the kings. He had walked alone. He had come to find her. She ran to him, not as a princess to a king, as a woman who had kept faith, as a sister to a brother, as a friend to a friend. She ran across the packed snow, in her rough dress, with chains still red around her wrists, and she did not stop until she had reached him. "You kept your promise," she said. "So did you," he answered. "My mother told me," she whispered, when he had taken her hands in his and lifted them gently so that the chain marks did not press into her skin, "to marry the man who loved my father more than he loved himself. I did not know who that man was until tonight." "I have loved your father since he held me in his arms," Aelric said. I have loved Eldoria since I was small enough to be carried in a farrier's sack. And I have loved you. Yes, even you, princess, before I had ever seen your face. Because your kindness to the children of the servants was the kindness of a queen, and the kingdom knew it, even when the court would not. She put her head against his shoulder. The 3 stars of House Valentis, pricked into his skin the night he was born, warmed against her cheek. "Oh, Edric," she said, smiling through her tears. "You have always had a name too big to wear. How did you carry it all these years?" "In my heart," he said, "next to your father's." On the first day of the new spring, in the rebuilt chapel of the royal castle, the chapel that had burned a generation ago, and that had been rebuilt by the late king, and that had been reconsecrated by the underpriest Father Ansel at dawn that morning, the king was crowned. He wore not the gold of his stolen inheritance, but the simple cloak of his childhood, the cloak of a stable boy, threadbare at the elbows, given to him by the farrier's wife on the night she had hidden him in the sack of feed. He wore the 3 stars openly on his shoulder for the first time in his life, and the crown, when it was laid upon his head by the eldest of the 4 visiting kings, was the simple iron crown of the late King Aldric, with no jewels, no gold, no finery, only iron and only the truth. And beside him stood the princess who had taught him to wait, Princess Seraphina, who would be his queen. She wore a white dress that had been sewn by the candlemaker's daughters in 3 nights, with no seam out of place and no stitch out of order, because every girl in the lower town had wanted to lay a stitch in the dress of the woman who had taught them to read. The compact of the 5 kingdoms was read once more, and this time it was sworn by every noble of Eldoria and every watcher across the 5 realms, by the hand on the sword and the kiss on the book, that no stolen child would ever be hidden again, no rightful heir would ever be denied, and no royal marriage would ever be used again as a weapon against a princess. The torch was passed. The bell was rung 3 times for the 3 stars of the true blood. The 5 banners were raised beside the silver banner of Eldoria, and the heralds, from the gate of the high chapel, read out the compact in 7 languages, so that every visitor in the streets might hear. The kingdom lived. In the years that followed, Queen Seraphina made the lower town her home as well as the high castle. She walked through the laundry district twice a week in a plain wool dress and no crown, to listen to the children read aloud to her, and to give them new books from the royal library, and to sit with the mothers and grandmothers at the small back room and drink tea from a chipped cup. She built a never-ending school for the children of servants, a school that is still standing in the lower town of what we now call the capital of Eldoria, 300 years later. The school has a plaque above the door in 3 languages, and on the plaque is written, "Here the remembered queen taught the forgotten children to read. Pass it on." The cook Mara lived in a fine house at the edge of the lower town, and refused every evening to allow the queen to cook her own bread. But the queen did so anyway, twice a year, once on the anniversary of the chapel fire, and once on the anniversary of the wedding. "For love of the years I stole from myself," she said, smiling. Lord Regner was tried by the Council of Kings. He was not executed, for kings of blood are not so cruel, but he was exiled to the icy north, where he lived out his days carving little wooden horses for the village children, and never speaking again of thrones. Lady Dorotha lived in a small cottage in the eastern wood, with 1 maid and a single white cat. She was heard, on occasion, to weep at night. The queen never punished her beyond her sorrow, for the queen had learned, by the time she was 23,
that sorrow is sometimes the deepest prison a soul can build for itself. And Princess Iselda, Dorotha's daughter, became, in time, the head of Seraphina's own court of charities. For the queen remembered that Iselda had been a child too, and had been made by her mother's cruelty what she had become, and that even a child of cruelty can become a woman of mercy if the mercy is large enough. And the king and the queen, the stable boy and the disgraced princess, ruled together for 40 years. They had 4 children. All 4 of them, the princes and the princesses of the restored throne, were taught to read at the back of the laundry, by candlelight, before they were ever taught to wear a crown. And the Kingdom of Eldoria, which had nearly been broken, was whole. And it remained whole for 100 years after, until the bards told the story as a song, and the priests told it as a parable, and the mothers told it to their children at bedtime, and the children, who had been taught to read by the queen herself, told it to each other in their own words. Because that is what stories are for. To be carried, by hand, from one pair of eyes to the next, from one fire to the next, from one kingdom to the next, forever. End. No matter how long the cruel sit on stolen thrones, the blood of the good will always rise. And no woman who has been called worthless will ever be worthless again, for she has always been the seed of the next kingdom.